Hello everyone, and it's that time. With Total War Warhammer 40k being announced, we have to talk about every possible faction that we can see, either in-game or as DLC, because remember that the Total War series does rely very heavily on DLCs. So in this video we're going to talk about everything, including the very obvious choices, because we need to talk about certain aspects, like for example Space Marines. There's a division that we'd see there. There is so much to talk about, and we're mostly going to focus around just the playable stuff at the moment. We'll kind of hit some stuff that may be there in the future, because I do believe that since this game is now going to be the next big thing, and it's going to be attached to the franchise that is getting actively supported, we'll likely see more and more factions come in. Think about, like, if Total War Warhammer and Warhammer Fantasy were still going, we would have seen a lot more races coming in, more to play around with. And we're not going to talk about all the units. That's going to have dedicated videos. There's going to be a lot of videos coming out. So without further ado, let's begin. Alright, so we're going to start off with the basics, because Space Marines are the poster boys for Warhammer 40,000. In general, for Warhammer also, everyone can recognize a Space Marine. So Space Marines have a lot going for them, and it very much depends on where Creative Assembly goes, because Space Marines have, well, basically two rosters. You've got the Primaris stuff, which I imagine is going to be the main focus, but also some Firstborn stuff, which is still kind of relevant, but less so every day, because, yeah, most of them are crossing the Rubicon. This will all make sense in future videos, don't you worry. So Space Marines themselves kind of are an elite force. The chapters, so groups of Space Marines as a whole, or a whole army in that sense, is about 1,000 Marines. It does vary with certain chapters, but I wouldn't imagine Space Marines being limited for that in Total War, because, I mean, it's Total War, right? That, and when there's big crusades going on, Space Marine chapters can go well above their chapter limit, so it's perfectly fine there. Generally, Space Marines are massive model counts for armies. A lot of them get sent out to companies, which are much smaller, so I wouldn't expect Space Marine armies being very huge in terms of unit numbers. The great thing about it is that there is a lot of types of Space Marines. In fact, yeah, I mean, let's be very clear here. There's a lot of bias by Games Workshop for Space Marines, with a lot of new Space Marines being introduced time and time again. You've got very cool tanks, you've got very cool infantry models, and everything in between, including some, like, really awesome stuff, right? Not just including the characters. Like, I'm a big fan of Terminators, for example. And Reavers, I'm a big fan of those. Sometimes I actually feel like I'm one of the few people that likes Phobos armor. The DLC potential for Space Marines is massive too, because some chapters have some dedicated units directly for them, right? Not only that, but they are supposed to be playing very differently, because, say for example, the White Scar is very good at fast moving stuff because they have a lot of bikes, whereas the Space Wolves, they work on a lot of skirmish warfare, getting up close and personal. It's kind of like Space Vikings. And it's not just the main chapters that can have something. Black Templars are a subgroup of the Imperial Fist, for example, but they are very, very different to a lot of other chapters because they focus on constantly being on a crusade. Their armies are much, much larger. I expect something like that to be like a Horde faction if Horde factions end up remaining in Total War, which I imagine so. So I could see a lot going on here. And yeah, I mean, it's expected. If you're kind of sick of, say, for example, Skaven DLC from Warhammer 2 or Chaos DLC in Warhammer 3, yeah, this one you have to be prepared for. Like, seriously, every new edition, it's Space Marines versus something else. I wish it was something different, but that's never going to happen. So, yeah, very popular faction. We can see a lot coming for them. Now, we're not done with Space Marines just yet. If we're going to talk about Space Marines, we have to talk about the Grey Knights too. So, the Grey Knights are Space Marines, but it's very, very different. Whilst a lot of the chapters will be very specialized in different types of things, and even the subgroups of those chapters will break away, Grey Knights are focused on being very anti-demon and very Psyker heavy. So, Psykers is like the 40k version of Spellcasters. Basically, every Grey Knight is a Psyker, and they're incredibly specialized at that. Their weapons do vary also, and this is a big thing just for the whole of 40k. Loads of different weapon options will come into effect, which will mean loads of different units overall. Personally, I very much like the Grey Knights. They're some of my favorite models to paint, though they have shown their age. There have been rumors every now and then that we might see new versions of them, but I think the general consensus is they can't actually cross the Rubicon for some reason or another, because a lot of their gene seed is directly from the Emperor. However, it is important to note, and don't worry about the gene seed stuff, that will be explained later on down the line, don't worry. My understanding is that as it goes with current law, There is no real distinction between Firstborn and Primaris Marine, so it could just be that they'll just get updated. They'll be updated to look more like Primaris Marines, which is just larger. It's more of a scale creep issue more than anything else, and then we could just have new versions of Grey Knights, which would be great. Mine are, well, it's the same models from this, from ages ago. Good lord, yeah, I'm looking at these, I'm like, these are quite old. Grey Knights are incredibly popular. They've got a lot going for them. I think it won't be an issue for them to be a DLC. And again, we've seen so many factions which are basically the same thing over and over that another style of Space Marine with just some different types of weapons would actually be a lot more different compared to some DLCs that we've seen in Warhammer 3. Them being anti-chaos too, it could provide for some roleplay factor. A lot of people like that immersion. We could start off campaigns and deal with chaos factions, so that works out quite well too. This is where things get a little bit weirder though, because there are more Space Marine factions here too. There's also the Deathwatch, and I know a friend of mine would be very annoyed if I didn't mention them. Basically, again, just Space Marines. I know. But the difference is that they work with being from other chapters. So the Deathwatch are just kind of like a prison in a sense. If you've done something that you need to atone for, some cases you'll be sent to the Deathwatch, where you'll be paired up with groups of other Space Marines from different chapters to get the job done. They're sent out on specialist missions. It depends really on what that group needs to do. I think they've been heavily focusing with the Deathwatch on Kill Team recently, which is kind of cool. I could see the Deathwatch being implemented in a build-your-own-faction type of sense. Different faction effects and lord effects that you could pick from. It's not big. It's not big. The Deathwatch, I find them kind of like meh, but people like them, and at the end of the day, Creative Assembly will see that and go, yeah, that'll probably sell. I mean, keep in mind that I think Games Workshop wanted to get rid of the Deathwatch originally, and then there was a massive backlash, and now they're back, which, I mean, that's kind of cool. People love Space Marines, also known as the Adeptus Astartes, and yeah, I could see it. I could just see them being implemented, maybe even as a free faction. Every now and then, Creative Assembly likes to do a free faction. Could work. Not really that much here to do. Most of those units could be implemented already by that point. Now, a lot of people would be saying, well, you're not mentioning the Dark Angels, Blood Angels, Space Wolves, Black Templars in detail. That's fine. Keep in mind that there's going to be videos coming up on that. There's so much that could be talked about in terms of battle tactics, how they could play in Total War. That's a really big thing. And remember that really, when it comes to Space Marines, a lot of them are very uniform. Sure, some aren't, but they kind of all fall in the same area, unlike, say, for example, when you go from the Chaos Space Marines, where you've got the generic warbands, and then you got, like, the massive changes with Death Guard and the rest. So don't you worry, loads of videos to come. Alright, we're going to keep on with the Imperium here, and we're going to talk about the Adeptus Sororitas, also known as the Sisters of Battle. If you think the Space Marines are terrifying, well, think about an angry nun with basically power armor and a lot of fire. Like seriously, loads and loads of flamers. The Adeptus Sororitas are a wildly large sect of the Imperium. I don't think a lot of people realize how much actually goes into it, because we do see them being split up into different parts. They form Hospitallers, for example, Carers, but also the Flaming Wrath of the Emperor. You can see a lot of different types of units. They've got their own specific faction type, and really they're kind of cool. This is for those who really just want a bunch of pissed off nuns and a lot of bolter fire. You got some pretty cool tanks, like with, for example, the Exorcist, a really fun one to paint up. They recently had a range refresh. Well, not recently now, it's been a while, but yeah, well, recent for Games Workshop standards. And they do have quite a lot. It's mostly females here. There are a few male units, but it's mostly just literally armies of warrior nuns. And they're super, super cool. Emulators, Exorcists, it's just awesome. And I feel like this is going to be a faction that we will eventually see, given their popularity. They've got a little bit of everything. I know some people might see them as very similar to that of Space Marines, and sure, but that's because like the Imperium is very close-knit, right? A lot of stuff like weaponry is kind of shared, or even just battle styles. So you can get like sisters which can fly, you can get them just on foot with a lot of different weapon options, tank support, a lot of different melee stuff with like the penitent engines and the mortifiers. They do have some range too, so you've got a little bit of everything. I could see this being focused very heavily on getting some buffs in, some battle prayers. Think about it like the warrior priest in Total War Warhammer. I like them. It's an army that I started painting, but there's just the white hair really is difficult for me to get sorted. I don't know why, I struggle with white paint a lot, but yeah. It's a cool faction. The Astra Militarum, or the Imperial Guard, are really the mainstay of the Empire. Yes, the people look towards the Space Marines as being like the big poster boys, but when you need numbers, you send in the Guard. There are so many different types too. Unfortunately, in most recent years, there hasn't been too much, because they've kind of separated, like, well, they're trying, because, like, the Krieg stuff has come back, but you've got Cadians, you've got the Kriegers, you've got the Catechans, you've got the Tempestus Scions. If we go back even further, you know, there's the Steel Legion, the Elysian Drop Troops. The thing about the Guard is, if you're looking for warfare, and if you're looking for varied warfare, every different Guard faction in between that, because there's loads of different sub-factions, would have different ways of waging war. Catechans, for example, the Catechan, are very much focused on a bit of skirmish warfare, very Rambo style, where then you've got the Kriegers, who are very good at like siege warfare, Cadians, who are your frontline kind of troopers, well, they've got a lot of infantry and a lot of artillery there too. There's so much that could, in theory, be done with the Imperial Guard. Like, they could make loads of sub-faction DLC if that's something that they'd like to do. And while, yes, a few of the units would be reskinned, there would be a lot of unique stuff if Games Workshop pull a finger out. And, not only that, different playstyles too. Once we're at it, given the fact that this is the first time I've gotten the Astra Militarum page for a long, long time, most of these Catechan troops were like from, I think, when I was a preteen. You know, that would be nice to get updated. Unlike all the other forces that we've already spoken about, the Imperial Guard would be in very, very large numbers. Hell, I would remember back in the days of 8th edition where people would just be fielding loads, and I mean loads of guardsmen, to the point that the table would just be pretty chock-a-block. Again, I'll have videos going over all the different types of guards as soon as I am set up, as there's a lot to talk about for the next few coming months, so this is going to be quite interesting. But we're going to move on to the Adeptus Custodes, a faction which is run into a little bit of controversy in recent times. Very, very weird ones on the Twitter space. But that's neither here nor there. We're going to be talking about this faction because if you think that Space Marines are kind of limited, with the chapters being around 1,000, the forces of the Adeptus Custodes, when they're actually sent out into warfare, because these are very, very rare, yeah, it's much smaller, because a Custodes is huge. Like, an army is very, very little models. They're just not really interesting, in all honesty, in my opinion, but I know that a lot of people do like the Custodes. You'll get them in terms of just massive custodian guards, for example. You'll have some other stuff like shield captains, blade champions, custodian wardens. They're very small, but they're extremely unique, and I would say, yeah, they've got some cool stuff about it too. Like, for example, the Legius Custodes Contemptor Gladius Dreadnoughts. It's like one of the coolest dreadnoughts they actually have access to. I could see this working out quite well for like a smaller Horde-style faction. We never know how they could be interpreted, alongside supporting Sisters of Silence, which the Sisters of Silence themselves are focused around being anti-psyker, which would really help a support army like this. Now, this is the only faction that I don't know how they could interpret too well, but we're going to have to wait and see. There is so much when it comes to the 40k universe, and some factions have received more attention than the others. Some of them are just more elite, which, yeah, we're going to talk about a few of those in this video. But before that, we're going to talk about the Toasters. This is a faction I really enjoy myself, the Adeptus Mechanicus. So if you're looking for beep boops all around, these are the engineers of the Imperium. They sort out a bunch of stuff. They've got some really cool units, in all honesty. They've gotten quite a lot of attention over the years, to be fair, and everything about them is, you know, a little bit of everything, actually. So they kind of are their own different subsect, and they've got flyers, they've got long-range shooters, they've got mechanical horses, they've got their own versions of mechs. For example, the Iron Striders, they've got their own version of dreadnoughts in a sense, even though they're just more robots, Castellan robots, which are very, very cool. I like them. I think they're going to be something that could be really interesting to see alongside the potential of a Dark Mech thing, but we'll talk about that a little bit later when we start talking about the Chaos stuff. The way I would explain this faction, if you've played Total War Warhammer before, think of this kind of like Ikit Claw. Lots and lots of machinery, lots and lots of firepower. They even do have some decent melee. I think everything's kind of covered here. And when we start going into like full breakdowns, there's like a lot to talk about. Because we have to talk about this, we have to talk about some former stuff, Forge World, all the usual. But Then we have to talk about something that might be a complementary faction or its own or both. Imperial Knights are a small roster, but the good thing about them is like everything can kind of have like multiple different weapon options, so you've got quite a lot of firepower there. Generally, there's not a lot for them. I mean, thankfully, they still have quite a lot of Forge World stuff, which I think was promised that they were going to change, or at least update them to resin, but it's taking their precious time. But they do have a faction, they do have an army book, and what could be done here is introducing them through a few units first as a support for the mechanicus, because that's basically how it started off originally, and then splitting them up into their own thing as a knightly order, because these things do actually show up. Now, you wouldn't be having a lot of units. Again, I don't know how this is going to work. It's going to be kind of weird, because doom stacking isn't really a thing for this, I guess. Maybe, you never know. It's just very odd, especially considering how some of these units are just very, very larger than life. Like, if you look at Warhammer Fantasy, you'd be bringing in armies with loads of different types of units, because that's how list building is done. Whereas, I think you can do a full 2,000 point list with just like 3 or 4 knight units. It's a weird thing. That's more modern Warhammer, whereas Old World focuses still on like old school Warhammer. I think it's going to be a DLC because there's like reusable potential here. They could easily add them in and then reskin a bunch of them, because let's be fair, a lot of the Chaos Knights are just basically reskins, and jump into that. Which means they could essentially have 2 content packs for very much like a 1.5 price development. Okay, so now before we jump onto the other sections, like, you know, Chaos on all the Xenos and stuff like that, we do need to talk about the Imperial Agents. So this is a book which is kind of like a mismatch between like the Sisters, the Grey Knights. There's a lot of different units there. Now, we're not really going to talk about those for now, right? In the future, we'll jump into like the Agents as a possible faction, a mishmash, mix-up, whatever. What we are going to talk about is like the potential, and there's going to be multiple dedicated videos on this, for sub-factions, because there are a lot of factions that don't currently have a book, but they do exist in the lore. For example, the Imperial Navy, the Adeptus Arbiters, or Arbites. I've seen it pronounced both ways, to be honest. But the idea here is that there's a lot of sub-factions, and I feel like we will maybe see some representation. Like the Navy breaches are very, very cool. The Space Corps, I mean, everyone likes that, right? I do imagine that certain things will also appear as naturally as possible. So, for example, Vindicar Assassins. There's quite a few. There's actually quite a lot of assassins. I could see them appearing with generic factions, like popping up with the Imperial Guard, popping up with the Sisters of Battle. It depends on how Creative Assembly want to really interpret this, because this is when we start looking towards Inquisitors and things get a little bit funky there. But, yeah, dedicated videos. We're going to move on to the other alignments because, well, they're not really alignments, but you know what I mean. There's a lot still to cover. We've only just done like the Imperium by Army Book, and I'm not even halfway through the Imperium in all honesty. Okay, so when there is order, there's also chaos, and we have to talk about a lot of factions when it comes to chaos. We'll start off with a very basic one, Chaos Demons. Now, Chaos Demons have been slowly kind of getting phased out, but I wouldn't imagine that they would get rid of them fully, because they can do another, like, Daniel situation there, especially since Vashtor is a thing. Well, Vashtor kind of leads towards Dark Mechanicum, and we'll talk about a possibility of a Dark Mechanicum in just a little bit. I still think that it's a good idea to do a Chaos Demon army. Most of the demons will be probably phased into their specific legions, but I think a Chaos Undivided faction does end up quite popular. The reason why it's not so popular in Total War Warhammer 3 is because the character is just kind of unlikable and doesn't really feel too great. But they've had the time to kind of jump in there and see how it is. I don't expect another Daniel character. I could expect an Undivided stuff, maybe with Be'lakor there, because it just makes sense. Be'lakor is such a big name when it comes to 40k. He's a Scooby-Doo villain. He's everywhere, right? So it just makes sense to have Undivided, give him access to all the demon units, and just let him have his fun. giving a little bit of access to some Chaos Space Marines, kind of like the reverse of what happens in Total War Warhammer, where he's more of a Chaos Warrior faction, but gets access to more demons than the other Chaos Warriors. And there you go, and this faction could easily just be implemented whenever, as long as the other Traitor Legions get added in, and I imagine that they would get added in by time, because all the main ones have been kind of represented now. Well, the 4 big ones, which are God-touched, we still don't have a lot of stuff for the Undivided, but there've been rumors popping up everywhere. We'll talk about that in just a sec. But first, we do have to talk about Chaos Space Marines, basically, Space Marines Undivided, because there's a lot of warbands out there, the more well-known one being the Black Legion. Chaos Space Marines are another poster boy for the 40k setting, because, there's a lot going in there. You should be able to get access to certain things, like from the God Touch stuff, like Khorne Berserkers and so on, Noise Marines, all the rest. But in most cases, there are a lot of units that they can just really go into. There's a lot of different types from like the basic Legionaries, Traitor Guard, and I do think that they should be ending up as a dedicated faction later. Warp Talons, Raptors, there's so many units that you can play around with. Because remember, stuff like the Helldrake, which you've seen in like Space Marine 2, it's not a dedicated Tzeentchian monster. You can have it with a lot of the different factions and the warbands. It's just, it kind of fits with Tzeentch. But there's stuff like the Forge Fiend, the Mauler Fiend. There's a lot. There's so much. And if they go by all the usual stuff, which is like, a different weapon type, rather than 40k where you can have kind of like mixed weapons, I don't think it's too common in 10th, but I haven't really had a lot of time in 10th myself lately. Mostly because I've been focusing on Old World. There could be so many different weapon types that you could literally have a full-ass roster. A lot of units will be very samey in certain cases, but that's kind of expected when it comes to this. Chaos Space Marines are really, really fun because you've got Psychers, you've got Engineers, you've got such heavy hitters. It's very similar to that of the Space Marine roster in certain parts. Not so much because there's not been a Primaris event just yet for the Chaos Space Marines, but I do imagine that that will happen at some point. And what really benefits the Chaos Space Marines is then it starts branching out. Like the Warriors of Chaos in Warhammer Fantasy, you can get dedicated warbands, and I think we'll start off with the Death Guard, because I know they're so popular. I remember, I think it was 8th edition, right, where basically everything had like a 5-up feel no pain, which was just stupid ridiculous. Actually made me stop playing for a bit, because everyone in the tournament scene was just playing Death Guard for a while. So, the Death Guard are Chaos Space Marines dedicated to Nurgle, with their Primarch being Mortarion. I will be talking about all the characters and later on in different videos. There's so much to talk about, to be honest. But, you can expect heavy hitters, very resilient troopers, some very decent artillery, and even just some really cool mechs. I'm a big fan of the Blight Haulers, for example. Very, very cool. Some Terminators. Essentially just mutating them very, very heavily there, alongside some stuff which would be considered, well, just undivided. So a Marked Defiler, for example, or a Hellbrute, or a Rhino. There's also demons here, because what's been happening with a lot of the more modern takes for certain Warhammer settings is that you're getting dedicated warriors alongside demons. So stuff that you already know, like Plague Bearers, Beasts of Nurgle, Nurglings, all that stuff acts as extra filler, which is why I said, demons should have their own dedicated faction. So you could get the undivided feel, but also you'd have your demons mixed up here. Think about it, how the monogod factions currently play in Total War Warhammer. So you've got access to some demons, you've got access to some, well, technically mortals, and all that kind of synergizes depending on how you want to play. And I could imagine that they'd go with the same system, certain buildings focusing around only mortals and certain buildings focusing only around the demons, and you can kind of mix and match if you wish, or you can have them as a purely dedicated side roster too. Death Guard are very popular. They haven't gotten too much new stuff in recent years, but to be fair, they launched with a pretty tasty roster as it stands, and that also kind of extends to another one. I hope you like Zangors with beaks, because they are here in the Thousand Suns roster. So very Tzeentchian focused here, as you can imagine. Demons, Beastmen, because there's a lot of Zangors, and also Rubic Marines. These are your very special types of Space Marines, because the Rubic Marines themselves, they're no longer flesh, they're pretty much dust in the inside. So you got Scarab Occult Terminators, Exalted Sorcerers, Rubik Marines themselves, very, very cool. I'm very much a big fan of them. But I, like many others, don't like painting way too much trim, because, oh my god. So yeah, Tzeentchian, Monogod style. This one has been here around for a while. They haven't gotten too much recently, though. They did get some kind of funky robots recently. I mean, that's pretty much it. They look cool. They just kind of feel out of place in a way. Yeah, but still, they've got a few named characters, obviously the big one being the Primarch Magnus the Red. Very, very cool model, very, very pretty, more than anything else, actually. Yeah, this one focuses on flamers and kind of like teleports and stuff. It's one of the few places that you'll see the Mutalef Vortex Beast being used, despite the fact that it's an undivided creature. But, you know, the distinction has been kind of changed up a little bit here. It's got a full roster. It's small, but it's got a full roster, and believe me, the other two that we're going to talk about now are even smaller. But the benefit here is we could see more new units coming out in the future, because unlike Total War Warhammer, this setting is very much active, so new units could easily pop up without too much of an issue. This is where the roster gets a little bit smaller in terms of unique troops, because the World Eaters are relatively new to the setting in terms of a brand new dedicated army book. They've existed for a long time, as you can imagine, but they don't have a lot, and it kind of sucks in that regard. But you do have decent weapon options, like for example the 8th Band, you know, they've got 2 hand weapons, whereas if you go onto like the Khorne Berserkers, you can see them with different types of like weaponry, pistols, maybe even a 2-hander, bolters, different types of bolters, which actually could end up being different types of units. It depends, again, on how things are going to be, but if they need to flesh out that roster, it's kind of like what they've done there with Total War Warhammer. The weapon options are the best way to just flesh out stuff and get your favorite units on the board quickly. When it comes to the dedicated stuff, I mean, there's cool characters, you know, Khan the Betrayer is a very big one, and obviously Angron, the Primarch of Khorne. I think that if anything, it could take a while before we end up getting these like dedicated warbands, and I probably think it's a smarter option too, because that way more units could come in without too much of an issue. It's just dependent on Games Workshop, I guess, or maybe they'll use Total War Warhammer 40k to well, just showcase stuff early. It's something that has happened before with Cafe, for example. We saw the Cafe and stuff, and then the minis came out like 3 years later. And then finally, my favorite Chaos faction, which, yeah, I'll paint the boxes eventually. One day. So, Emperor's Children finally got a box release, and, well, I won't call it a full roster, but there's enough there to add in some fun stuff, right? Fulgrim and also Lucis the Eternal, alongside brand new plastic Noise Marines. Very, very important to talk about that. Plastic Noise Marines. No more Finecast and no more, like... Yeah, oh my god, it just feels great, doesn't it? Tormentors. There's a very small amount of new units here. With the only one that I don't actually like here being the Flawless Blades, because they've just got like cone heads and it just feels really, really odd. But again, mixed up with some stuff available to Undivided and also some Slaanesh Demonettes. Mostly Demonettes, because they got rid of all the chariots. I'm not sure why that was a thing. I'm not sure if they're back through Legends or something. But the Slaanesh Demon roster got completely gutted for the Emperor's Children, which really, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, really fucking sucks. But yeah, I mean, it's all the main types, right? This is where you'll have like Chaos Space Marines Undivided through all these different types of like warbands, but then these God-touched ones add in a lot of flavor too. Dedicated warbands is a great way to go, as we've seen with Total War Warhammer. It would be very silly not to do it, and I doubt that they wouldn't. There's so much DLC potential. And all this works as cross-marketing for the miniatures also. So Games Workshop would highly incentivize Creative Assembly to cover as many factions as available on the tabletop. Maybe even some extra ones if they've got some extra plans. The last ones of the playable factions is the Chaos Knights, and like I said, it's literally just like the same thing. The only thing different, I think, is like, what, the Carnivores and the Renators, I think? Yeah, like in most cases, it's literally just the same models, and you just like paint them Chaos. This is why I said, like, yeah, I could see this being done as supporting troops first with just like the very basic stuff, so some Executioners and maybe a Tyrant, something very, very small there, or Questoris, and then doing a faction pack. Hey, I wouldn't be opposed to Creative Assembly just going, okay, one faction pack, but it actually is 2 factions. So you get a Knightly Order for the Loyalists, and then a Knightly Order for the Chaos stuff. And yeah, it's 2 birds, 1 stone. It's not really like they can do much here. It's literally just adding in some spikes, and Yeah, it's literally just adding in some spikes. So we won't talk about this much, but we do have to talk about stuff that really isn't a faction, but is in lore, and could potentially end up as a thing. Traitor Guard is something that could be easily done as a DLC. I prefer the old Forge World ones, but these ones are good too. It's just like the style of the old Forge World ones was really, really cool. So essentially this would just be Guardsmen that turn Traitor. And that would be done with, you know, the usual. You've got these types of troops, then you'd get some other stuff like Ogrins, make them Chaos Ogrins, just Basilisks, put some spikes on it. It's a lot of spikes. This is just how Chaos works when it comes to 40k. You see, Fantasy just had different cultures. 40k, it's kind of like whole regiments falling to Chaos, so they just like, there are slow mutations. They can be very, very like basic ones for Guardsmen, but in most cases, it's just like, yeah, they're using stolen equipment or their own equipment that has just been kind of like duct taped back together to keep on working, unless they're using stub guns, which is just more like original type of warfare rather than the las guns. I'll be honest with you, I think it's just Games Workshop doesn't know what they want to do with the Traitor Guard themselves, but it would be a massive waste if we didn't see this coming up. Again, we've seen factions pop up like the Vampire Coast and so on, so yeah, I think it could be doable. Plus, if they want to do like a Traitor Guard mini range, that would be really lovely, you know? But yeah. Alright, and then lastly, well, not really lastly because we have to do the Xenos, but lastly for Chaos at least, we have to talk about the Dark Mechanicum. So the Dark Mechanicum exists, doesn't have really a model range, finally starts to get a little bit of stuff for like the 30k franchise, but I do imagine that it'll be something that we'll see down the line in the future. It's way too easy for them to make a lot of money, and to be fair, you have to see it this way, right? There has been a lot of factions coming into 40k and, well, just in general over the years. I don't see a world where the Dark Mechanicum doesn't really get really represented. I mean, it's going to be weird because there's not a lot. I mean, right now it's just like it's on the epic scale, right? And there's not really a lot there either. It's just kind of using the normal Mechanicum stuff. But keep in mind that that is during the actual break, the Civil War. So the unique stuff would happen more in 40k. At least one would think. I don't know. I'd like to see it. I'd like to see this happen. Every Chaos faction getting represented. A lot of people like the Toasters. What about Evil Toasters? Okay, so now we have to jump into the Xenos, and there is a lot to talk about here. We'll start off with the Eldari. So the Eldari are basically the Space Elves, right? Think of them as the High Elves of the 40k universe. They've got a lot to them because the great thing about the Eldari is they've got a lot of specialized troops, right? So the Dark Reapers are very good at shooting, for example, whereas same as the Rangers, but those are more like snipers. Then you've got Warp Spiders that can teleport, you've got some fast bikes, you've got some very strong Psychers, which are your spellcasters, you've got some durable mechs with the Wraith Guard and the Wraith Blades. There is really a lot that comes into here. Very varied, a lot of hover tanks, a lot of fast-moving things, which I think has always been like a really big push for the Eldar as a whole. It's quite nice to see some big changes coming in, obviously. The models have been finally starting to get updated. They're not the same ones from the 90s. Well, some of them are still the same models from the... Yeah, we'll just ignore that, right? Personally, I quite like the Eldar. I think they're kind of cool. I've always kind of favored the Xenos races a little bit more, mostly because it's just nice to have something a little bit different. I could see this being like a really fun faction to play if they're very, very mobile. There'd be a lot of skirmish stuff with like the Howling Banshees, but I imagine it would be like skirmish shooting too. Could see a lot of movement coming in here. Again, very much depends. Obviously, interpretation from lore, tabletop, and then video game can always be very different. Like, for example, the Skaven in Total War Warhammer play very differently to how they play on the tabletop. But yeah, if you're looking for like generic, kind of good race, well, they're not really because they're very self-centered, but I mean, this is 40k. This is probably going to be the one for you if you like aliens, you know, or better yet said, Xenos. The Drukhari, on the other hand, are like the Dark Eldar, so a lot more gothic style, emo phase, it's not a phase mom type of shit. Still focusing on a lot of skirmish type warfare, a lot of fast moving stuff, The model range has been due for an update for a while, and some new units, to be fair. But yeah, like this is if you like the more torturous effort, if you like a lot of fast moving, like really weird stuff like the Kronos or the Talos. Helions are super cool too. Dark Eldar haven't really been in a good spot as far as I'm aware, so hopefully they'll get some updated stuff so they can get some new, much needed new stuff. They did have a new character pop in recently, but this is the problem with 40k in most recent years. It's like, oh yeah, here's another 5 Space Marine units. Here's 1 new character for your Eldar. Never mind that you need new units and new troops overall. But, you know, you're an elf, so it doesn't matter. Which I can kind of agree with. Let's talk about the leads of Votann. If you like dwarfs and you want dwarfs in space, here you go. So these are relatively new, recently getting their second wave of models after a pretty lengthy break. But essentially what they are is clones of the original squads. Very, very mechanically focused, as you can see. And they work with other races and factions too. I don't think that this is the last expansion to their race that we're going to see, considering that, yeah, I mean, they are pretty cool. They are honestly very, very cool. I like them. I like them. It's a lot of heavy gunpowder, a lot of like buggies and stuff. It's very themed, and I feel like if they add in a few extra units here and there, it could just be a bit more complete. Again, 40k doesn't need like the massive rosters that Fantasy did, but there's not a lot of choice, and I like choices, which is why I could see them coming down later down the line. I doubt that there's going to be a Chaos version. You never know, because sometimes Games Workshop just likes to jump into it. An evil one. I think there is mention of like an evil-ish one, but I haven't read through their codex in a while, and to be fair, most codexes are now removing a lot of lore. Yeah, you just kind of have to, like, if you want to learn your lore, you have to deal with like YouTube channels or Warhammer Plus. And I mean, a lot of people don't want to go to Warhammer Plus because there's not a lot of worth in there just yet, at least from my opinion, right? Alright, let's talk about one of my factions now. I play Tau. Yes, you can boo and hiss all you want, but I like the Tau, and these guys are relatively new in terms of lore, right? Like, they have only existed for a certain amount of periods, they expanded very quickly. These are your Gundam-style factions with loads of shooting, loads and loads of high-range shooting. Like, back in the day, you could shoot from across the table. I think the pulse rifles still have, like, 30-inch range. I haven't played in 10th, unfortunately. I'm just kind of waiting for 11th at this point. But there are so many things. There's the Pathfinders. There's the Fire Warriors, which kind of jump into, like, strike teams and breacher teams. Different weapons involved there, too. You've got Ethereals, which are your Psychers. You've got really, really cool mech suits like the Riptide, which is absolutely awesome. The Broadside, the Storm Surge, I've got 2 of those, very, very fun. Honestly, if you like a lot of tech, this is going to be the tech faction for you. You suck at melee though, keep that in mind. Like, there's only very, very 1 in 1 trillion chance that you're going to go in there and do a decent amount of melee. Yeah, Farsight exists, but he's a traitor, and we'll talk about Farsight in his own possible faction video later down the line. I really like the Tau. There's a lot to go around for them because it's not just the Tau. The Tau also have other factions helping them out, like, for example, the Kroot, which are kind of avian-like monsters. They evolve very rapidly depending on what they eat. So basically anything that you see that's a Kroot, right? So Kroot Orks or even Kroot Hounds, those are just Kroot. They've just changed out quite dramatically there through their rituals and their eating. There's also Gavessa, there's stuff like the Vespids. I could see like culture packs being added in for the sake of that. The Gavessa are basically just Imperial Guard that have been absorbed in. The Vespids are, well, there's not really a lot of Vespids. It's more just focused around like Kill Team at this point, I think. But there's a lot that can be done with that. There's more factions that we don't know about too. Well, we know about, but we have never seen on the tabletop represented or ever so slightly. I could see a lot of DLC stuff coming in from this point, right? And again, there's so much that can be done. The Tau, the main thing with the Tau is just like the Tau troops themselves, but they know that they can't do everything. They're fast, but they're not stealthy. That's where the Vespid come in. Sometimes they need a little bit more aggression and good melee. That's where the Kroot come in. Sometimes they just need a lot of bodies. That's where the Traitor Guard in that point, although they're not really traitors, but the Gavessa come in, you know? There's a lot that can be done with Tau, and I would be really disappointed if the Tau don't have representation from the lesser sub-races there, you know? I mean, they're absorbed in, but most of them get sterilized, so it's not like they can mostly reproduce. They're members of the Empire, but yeah, very, yeah. Right, Orks. If you like Orks in Warhammer Fantasy, then dial them up to 11, and that's what you get in 40k. Basically, this is the looter race. They'll pick up anything, and literally anything, and just try and turn it into a weapon. Essentially, what you can believe in hard enough, and with enough duct tape, it's pretty good. This is very much your numbers army. Orks come in with loads and loads of troops, loads and loads of buggies. In most recent times, also some like giant squig stuff, because obviously like the beast snaggers are back and being relevant again. It's so much varied. Like, oh my god, if you go in through like Orks, they've got so many different types of troops. People complain about the Space Marines, but the Orks are so well loved. And I've just seen that the Gargantuan Squig-Off is back. I thought that was actually removed. God damn it! Wow. Sorry, that just surprised me. But yeah, they'll pick up Space Marine tanks that they loot, and then they'll fix it up. Same thing with like human tanks. They do that with like Lehman Russers. They do it with the same thing with their jets. There's so much variety to the Orks purely because they can literally do anything. And I think that just adds in so many possibilities. Like, you could get Ork boys and have them with so many different weapons. You could get, oh my god, trucks with any extra attachments, so there'll be loads of different variants. The Mega Knobs too, basically like the Ork version of the Terminators. Mega Armor also was the Big Macs. Yeah, it's basically just like, imagine if... The best way to explain it for those of you who might have only played Fantasy is like, imagine if Wurzag, right, very insane as he is, but if he had access to Ica Claw's workshop and he knew how to use it. And I think that's what's going to be here, right? Very similar. I imagine very similar style of mechanics with like wars and stuff, but it's just more dialed up. And I can't wait. I really love like the Squig Buggy and so on. So I really can't wait to see like Orks in-game. That's going to be amazing. Necrons. So these guys got a lot of attention over the past few years, and yeah, I mean, if you like Tomb Kings and you want them to be just really highly technology based and just really destructive, and I mean really destructive, this is the faction for you. Yeah, it's basically very slow moving troops, very slow moving troops, but the benefit of the Necrons is that they've got this protocol, which basically means troops die, they come back. They've also got like enslaved gods. Oh my god, I didn't know the Heavy Construct was back. God, I really need to check this a lot more. That's a really good unit. So, yeah, there's a lot of really cool stuff when it comes to the Necrons. A lot of their guns are incredibly hard-hitting. They've got some melee too. They're very durable. The fact that they can keep regenerating, and that basically means that their numbers aren't going to be that affected. Like, you can kill a full squadron of Immortals, for example, and then, you know, the Necron Lord just goes, snaps his fingers, and they come back, right? There's something really cool about the Necrons. I think a lot of people do like them. I honestly think that they've got a pretty decent-sized roster, too, so I don't think it'll be too much of a problem. The thing is, again, when it comes to this, I don't know how much DLC could be done, which ultimately might be a big thing. They might have to focus on faction characters more than that, because we don't want an issue where a lot of units are missing and the faction is just not that playable. And it depends, once again, on really weapon options and unit variants. But again, we have to wait and see. Tyranids, who doesn't love bugs? There are so many different types of troops here. So there are like just loads and loads, actually. The Tyranids got a lot of attention over the years, and it's really nice to see some of the old Forge World stuff still available, I think. Let me go down, because it's been a while. Yeah, there's the, there's a few of the Forge World things. And obviously the Kill Team stuff has added a lot of stuff. They just recently had a range refresh, which was pretty good. But this is a Swarm, a Synapse, which I think this could be done so well in terms of, rather than you are in direct control, because obviously you're the player, but you'd be getting missions sent to you directly from like the hive mind. I don't know. My interpretation could be a bit strange, and we'll have to wait and see when I like read through like the lore again, because like there's a lot of faction videos I want to do, but I want to like jump into the lore and make some notes on how factions could play, because I feel like we're going to have a lot of videos to talk about stuff. You've got flyers, you've got melee, you've got shooters, a lot of melee, so keep that in mind. But there's stuff that can get hidden. You've got some anti-psychers. It's just, there's not anything I think that's kind of missing here, really. I think that the Tyranids are one of those factions that just have a little bit of everything. It makes a big benefit for that. It's a lot of bugs. People like Tyranids. But last but not least, yep, we have the Gene Stealer cult. So again, it's very much the Imperial Guard, but you have a lot of troops here which are kind of like hybrid mutants, because the Gene Stealers, the Tyranid invasion, some of them just like, they throw in some Gene Stealers to kind of reproduce and kind of corrupt the world from within is probably the best way of saying it. You'd be using a lot of your Guardsman stuff, and it's very heavily incentivized, actually, if you go on like the Games Workshop website for that. Because I feel like a few units were kind of removed. I don't know, it kind of feels like it. Or maybe they just added so many Guard stuff that it just really feels like it. It's like a second generation, third generation, well, different generations. So they look more and more human, essentially. But they're still subservient to everything else that's going on. And what these guys do is they prepare the planets for the eventual invasion from the Tyranids. I don't know if these guys could be a faction, or they're just going to be like a faction effect with extra units that could be used by the Tyranids or something, but I don't know, man. I do feel like the Gene Stealer cults can be relatively popular. So, yeah, we're going to have to wait and see, but I like them. I like them. I mean, there's not a faction that I don't really like with 40k. There's really a lot that brings them to life, but time will have to tell. Now, before we end this video, as you can imagine, it's a pretty long one, there are loads of things that could happen in the future. Like, for example, the Harlequins aren't really their own faction anymore. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Harlequins became a thing. The problem here is that factions come and go. And it's just how it happens. This is how it's happened with Warhammer Fantasy also, where we lost certain factions because the Dogs of War wasn't really selling, so they decided not to make it a thing again. You never know for the future. But there's factions that have come and gone for 40k, and there's new factions that we see, right? Because remember that Games Workshop have taken to this thing of like a new faction every year. Sometimes it's every edition. It does depend, because like right now it's been more and more, which is why factions are launching with less every time, which is kind of disappointing. But you never know, maybe with Creative Assembly now involved, things might get a little bit faster. I think the very important thing to note here, again, is that this is an active setting. So active settings generally get more support, get more toys, get more everything. And I could see that happening here. I could see a case that we'll see brand new Space Marines being announced in terms of miniature form. Games Workshop like to announce stuff way in advance. And then later down the line, we could see those brand new Space Marines or Orks or Necrons or whatever being introduced in the form of DLC. Wouldn't be surprised totally. I honestly would not be surprised if we start to see unit packs, kind of like what happens with with Gladius, where you've got maybe 8 units being introduced. I think actually they just recently announced the DLC and released it too. But like it's like 8 units and it's 1 per faction. Personally, wouldn't want that, but I don't think it's out of the question. Again, we have to see how they're going to handle everything. It's still very early days. I'm not too sure exactly what is coming out in terms of information in some cases, because they've kept really quiet. They have kept very, very quiet from us, which is really funny because they leaked Total War 40k themselves in their own reveal video. It's just, you know, CA being CA. But let me know what you guys think about this. I'm going with all the army books because that's the general thing, but I could imagine more coming. Are there any other factions mentioned in the lore that you think could be done, introduced into the game? Let me know in the comments below. Let's start a bit of discussion. Just a gentle reminder, I am traveling, so if I'm not responding to like DMs or comments or whatever, it's because, yeah, like I get a little bit of time to sit down, to record. I'm basically script writing as I travel. And then, then I've got to sort out the house. It's happened at the worst fucking time possible. I'm not going to lie to you. Have a good one, guys. I'll see you all again very, very soon. Bye.